dating back to the last days of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union in the late 1980s was reaching out to end the Cold War and make peace with the United States and with Europe. And if we had accepted that basic proposition put forward by President Gorbachev back in the late 1980s, that this was an opportunity for real peace and real cooperation, we would never have come to the war in Ukraine. President Gorbachev unilaterally disbanded the Soviet military alliance, the Warsaw Pact. And at that moment, the German Chancellor Helmut Kohl saw the opportunity for the rapid reunification of Germany. To achieve that, the German government and the United States reached out to Gorbachev and said, look, you are disbanding the Warsaw Pact. Germany can reunify. We will not take advantage of that. We will not, to be specific, move NATO even 1 inch eastward. And Gorbachev said, that's important. And during 1990, the US and Germany and the NATO Secretary General Manfred Werner, because I point out that he repeated this in June 1990, told Gorbachev on repeated occasions, NATO will not expand. And this, I think, is the starting point of the war, because the US broke its word almost immediately. With the end of the Soviet Union, the United States leaders decided the US is now the unchallenged and unchallengeable superpower. We can do what we want. Even though Russia is the successor state to the Soviet Union, technically even the continuation state, it could be said, meaning that treaties and other obligations on arms control and so forth continue to apply. The United States decided that, well, we'll expand NATO. We won. They lost. NATO will now expand eastward. And ultimately, the decision was made in the 1990s that NATO would expand eastward, not just to Central Europe, not just to Eastern Europe, but into the former Soviet Union, the Baltic states, then Ukraine and Georgia. And therein really is the root of this war, that this became a victory celebration of the West rather than an agreement between the West and the former Soviet states, which it should have been, because that would have been the basis for a lasting peace.
In August 1991, Ukraine declares independence on the basis of the 1990 that you mentioned was a declaration of state sovereignty. How did it happen even before the collapse of the Soviet Union?
Well, this was one of the precipitating events that led to the end of the Soviet Union, was that as of August 1991, the Soviet Union was coming apart. Gorbachev was kidnapped, remember, and there was an attempted putsch in the Soviet Union just at that time. And Ukraine, among other of the states of the Soviet Union, started to push for their independence. Even in the previous year, there was this declaration of state sovereignty, which declared Ukraine to be a sovereign. Now, what's interesting in both 1990 and 1991 is that Ukraine declares its statehood or independence or sovereignty on the basis of neutrality. It did not aim to be a NATO country at the time, surely not. It wanted to be a neutral country. And that is fitting because Ukraine being the western boundary of the Soviet Union, with the name Ukraine meaning at the border. So it was borderlands of the Russian Empire even before the Soviet Union. Ukraine knew that it is a country that is at the crossroads between the West and the East in many, many ways, in culture, in its political history, in its physical geography, obviously, in religion, because Western Ukraine is Catholic and Protestant, primarily Eastern Ukraine Orthodox, linguistically between Ukrainian speaking and in the West and Russian speaking in the East. It was prudent to say, we will be neutral. And from a pragmatic point of view, having in any event a kind of buffer zone between Russia and the West was prudent for both sides, so that there would not be a return of tensions based on military supremacy or threats that would come if the two sides were right up against each other on a single border.
In 1992, President Bush, you mentioned that administration policymakers reached a secret internal consensus to expand NATO. This is after the collapse of the Soviet Union, after Warsaw Pact, after Cold War, tremendous opportunity for peace. Yet we see this administration goes the other way.
This is the so-called neoconservative turn in the United States. The imperial side of the debate won, which is the notion, which was very attractive to U.S. leaders and politicians and the security state, that now the U.S. is the world's hegemonic power. There's not any country that remotely can compete with the U.S. The U.S. Secretary of State in the 1990s, Madeleine Albright, called the U.S. the indispensable nation. Many people wrote articles about the U.S. being the most powerful country in history, even more dominant than Rome, and so forth. This was a very heady moment. The U.S. had won the Cold War in the U.S. view. The U.S. had just won the Gulf War against Iraq, showing the might of America's sophisticated armaments. Russia was flat on its back in economic exhaustion and internal political divide. China was a nation of peasant rice cultivators. There was no conceivable threat to the United States seen in those days. So the arrogance was running very, very high, and it just seemed right. Well, now we can start claiming more pieces on the board. And NATO enlargement was quickly taken up. There were internal debates in the Clinton administration. I refer to decisions already taken in the last year of the Bush senior administration. But when Clinton came in, there were some continuing debates. His own Secretary of Defense, William Perry, was strongly against NATO enlargement because he said it will spoil or poison the emerging good relations with Russia. And he was very prescient about that. But he was overruled by the hardliners. Certainly the public face of the hardliners was Madeleine Albright, the Secretary of State, who said, we're going to do it. And this was perhaps her Central European roots, or her view of America as the indispensable power. But generally, both in the Democratic and the Republican parties, the political leaders of foreign policy were in favor of U.S. muscle flexing and NATO enlargement. It is not incidental to mention that starting in the mid-1990s, a lobbying campaign for NATO enlargement was led by none other than the chief lobbyist of Raytheon, one of the major military companies in the United States. So there was big money to be made selling U.S. armaments to what would be the candidate or new NATO member countries. And no doubt the commercial side of this also had its significant play.
In February 1992, we have this Wolfowitz Doctrine. Do you think that this doctrine was the case since the collapse of the Soviet Union?
Well, the idea of the Wolfowitz Doctrine, or Wolfowitz and Cheney, or Wolfowitz, Rumsfeld and Cheney, but soon it would be, again, bipartisan, was that now the U.S. would be the dominant power in the world, and it should basically ensure U.S. dominance in every part of the world, and take actions to ensure that the U.S. would not be threatened by any regional power in any new part of the world, including a lot of regime change operations to get rid of governments that had been Soviet allies, so that we could have a U.S. backed and pro-U.S. government in places where the Soviet Union had influence. Countries like Syria, like Iraq, like Libya, and specifically places where the U.S. went to war over the next dozen years or so to clean up those remnant Soviet allies, or what were in some cases still pro-Russian allied governments like Assad in Syria. So these neocons already in the early 1990s were thinking of the wars or the regime change operations that would put pro-US governments in place in the Middle East and in other sensitive areas. That's the style of American foreign policy. If you don't like a government, change it. I don't mean your own government, I mean someone else's government. It's a very peculiar approach to international affairs. It also is done in general in a secretive mode, though often many people are aware of the US fingerprints, but because it's done in a secretive mode, if you point out, oh, there goes the US again, changing government, the US officials say, no, we had nothing to do with that. That was just local events. But of course, the United States behind the scenes was repeatedly engaging in regime change operations and does so until today. The US has its hands in pushing from power Imran Khan in Pakistan, for example, because Imran Khan was too close, they thought, to Russia and to China. So they warned senior politicians in Pakistan, you better get rid of him or we'll get tough with you. And this led to his ouster by the parliament. We know that because documents have since come to light describing the US threats, in fact. So this regime change approach was really, it's been around for a long time. The US used regime change nonstop during the Cold War period, but the Rumsfeld and Wolfowitz and Cheney group in the Bush senior administration basically said, now we continue with that approach in the post-Cold War world.
In 1999, here you mentioned this bombing of Serbia. How did that play out for this war in Ukraine?
The U.S. bombed Serbia for almost 7 weeks, bombing Belgrade, NATO bombing, in fact, to ostensibly force Serbia to relinquish its hold on part of its territory on Kosovo. And this was a U.S.-led war to break Serbia in part because the U.S. had decided to support Kosovo for independence. It's an interesting event in many, many ways. First, it It was really the first major war in Europe since the end of World War II, not Ukraine, as is often said, but Serbia. Second, it was a NATO operation, in my view, giving lie to the repeated claim that NATO is a defensive organization. NATO is a military organization that serves at the behest of U.S. foreign policy, and that was shown in 1999. Third, it gives lie to the idea that borders are sacrosanct and should never be changed by force, because the U.S. used force to break apart Serbia. And of course, the Russians have repeatedly pointed to that as an example of how countries divide and so forth, and the role of the West. But the U.S. is never very sensitive to these illustrations of its hypocrisy. They're just brushed off and ignored. But it was a seminal event, not only for Serbia, but also for the lessons that Russia took from it, which is that NATO is an aggressive military organization serving U.S. interests, and U.S. interests are basically not bound by the United Nations, but by U.S. prerogatives, and regime change is definitely one of those prerogatives that the U.S. repeatedly claims.
In 2000, the Ukrainian president Kuchma declares that there is no question of Ukraine joining NATO today, since this issue is extremely complex.
Actually, opinion surveys show that until Yanukovych's overthrow in 2014, the country was mainly against joining NATO. And public opinion, led in part by President Kuchma or President Yanukovych and others, who told them this is very complicated, it could get us into a lot of trouble, we should be very, very careful. That was reflected in the public view that better that Ukraine not join NATO.
In 2002, U.S. unilaterally withdraws from the anti-ballistic weapons treaty.
The ABM treaty should be seen in the context of nuclear strategy. The idea of anti-ballistic missile defense is that if such a defense is put in place, then it can enable the country that has that anti-ballistic missile defense to actually make a first strike against the other side, because the other side would lose the retaliatory power because of missile defense against that retaliation. So the Russians viewed the anti-ballistic missile treaty as a stabilizing treaty, because it meant that Russia's land-based missiles were, from Russia's point of view, a deterrent to an American nuclear strike on Russia. In 2002, the United States said, we're getting out of the treaty, ostensibly because we want anti-ballistic missile defense against Iranian missiles, it was said. But the Russians said, how do we know you're not going to use that defense against our missiles, thereby rendering our retaliatory deterrent null and void? And the U.S. never gave an answer to that. So the Russians viewed the U.S. withdrawal from the anti-ballistic missile treaty as destabilizing and very provocative. It was an action that was taken unilaterally. It was followed over the next 2 decades by the placement of U.S. missiles in Poland and Romania. And those missile placements of Aegis missiles were viewed as an extreme national security threat to Russia. Basically, American missiles a few minutes away from Russian territory And the US said, but these are just defensive missiles. And the Russians repeatedly said, how do we know what you put in these missile silos? They can be offensive, they can be defensive, they can be anything, but we have no capacity to verify. This is outside of any agreed treaty arrangement. This is extremely dangerous. And it was one of the arguments that Russia used repeatedly, and I think quite credibly, to say we don't want Ukraine in NATO under any circumstances for even more American missiles to be put even closer to our border. We don't trust the United States. It doesn't abide by treaties. And we therefore don't trust a US-led military alliance on our border.
In 2004, we have this Orange Revolution inside Ukraine. What's the importance of this Orange Revolution?
In all of the Ukrainian elections, the division between nationalist Ukrainians, mainly in Western Ukraine, and more pro-Russian and often ethnically Russian Ukrainian voters in the east and south of Ukraine meant that elections were very close. And in 2004, there was a very close election. And the United States and a number of NGOs financed by the United States claimed that the elections were fraudulent or that the results were false, and that the pro-American candidate, Viktor Yushchenko, had won over Viktor Yanukovych, the more pro-Russian candidate. And ultimately, this led to protests and to a court ruling in Ukraine that the election should be run again. And in the second round, or the second time, the pro-US candidate, Viktor Yushchenko, won the election. The Americans said, well, that is the fair count. And the Russians said, that is how regime change works. You bought these NGOs, you bought these protests, you stoked the protest, you made sure that everything was done so that your candidate would win. And they called this a US regime change operation. The US called it essentially a revolution of dignity, and a term that would be used later for the Maidan. But it showed the deepening distrust, because there was no question the United States heavily funds political activity in other countries. The US would never tolerate this inside the United States, but it very heavily funds political parties, movements, and so forth. And the Russians are looking at this and saying, yes, we understand you're playing games on our neighboring country. The US says, no, you're the one playing games, but you can see it's a complete breakdown of trust. I personally am against the US financing this kind of political operation in another country, period, because I use the standard, what would be acceptable from a US point of view, and I know it would not be acceptable that foreign governments were deeply implicated in our election process. So I think the United States is, at a minimum, extremely imprudent, but I'd say quite believably much more deeply involved in turning events one way or another. And that was the claim that was made in 2004 by Russia.
In 2007, Putin strongly criticizes the US attempt to create a unipolar world in Munich Security Conference.
Putin said, enough, you're surrounding us. Because remember, in 2007 also, there was a massive NATO enlargement that included not just the first three new members, Hungary, Poland, and the Czech Republic, but 7 new members coming in George Bush's period, the 3 Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, 2 Black Sea states, Bulgaria and Romania, and two Balkan states, Slovenia and Slovakia, let me say, not quite Balkan states, but this meant 7 new NATO members, and Putin really was extremely strong in 2007 in this annual Munich Security Conference. Stop. You violated the promises that you made 17 years ago about not 1 inch eastward, and you are absolutely threatening us. Now, remember, this is a context in which NATO has bombed Belgrade. This is a context in which the U.S. unilaterally withdrew from the ABM treaty. This is a context in which the U.S. is deeply meddling in Ukraine's politics. So Putin says in 2007, enough, stop any more NATO enlargement. Of course, the U.S. never listens to such complaints.
In 2008, we have the U.S. ambassador to Russia, then U.S. ambassador to Russia, William Burns, now director of CIA. He wrote this amazing memorandum talking about the NATO enlargement. This entry of Ukraine in NATO is the brightest of all red lines.
Yes, that famous memo, "Niet" means "niet." Really, it's not just Putin, it's the entire political class of Russia that utterly rejects NATO enlargement to Ukraine. And the memo is very clear. This could really be destabilizing. Now, at the time, Burns was the U.S. ambassador to Russia. Now he's the CIA director. He knows how provocative America has been. And interestingly, this memo was a WikiLeaks. We only know about it because WikiLeaks showed it to us. The American people are not really told anything about any of this because the whole idea of American foreign policy is that the public should be ill-informed and listen to the official narrative, which our media just blindly repeat and just go along with whatever the U.S. government is saying. But once in a while, we get a leak that shows us the truth of what these policymakers are really saying to each other. And it's pretty ugly because it's very much at variance with what we hear as official statements from the government.
In February 2008, U.S. recognizes Kosovo independence over heated Russian objections.
Well, this is just to say that NATO broke up Serbia by design. Serbia was an ally of Russia. The Russians complained. The UN Security Council obviously could not endorse this because Russia and I presume China and others would have objected. But the US goes ahead and recognizes Kosovar independence in any event. And this comes back later when Russia holds a referendum in Crimea, which shows overwhelming Crimean support for being part of Russia rather than being part of Ukraine. And the United States says that's absolutely unacceptable. And Russia says, well, what about Kosovo? And the United States doesn't answer. It's an example of US hypocrisy at a minimum, but a very influential one in terms of how Russia came to view the US during this period, which is as a country that would not negotiate over anything, just took unilateral moves.
In April, NATO declares that Ukraine and Georgia will become members of NATO. It's officially the first time they're officially announcing that, isn't it?
In 2008, at the Bucharest summit, George Bush put on the table for all of NATO to endorse NATO enlargement to Georgia and to Ukraine. At the time, the European countries were strongly against this because they understood how dangerous and provocative it was. And so they refused to support a clear roadmap for Ukraine to join. But Bush insisted, and remember, this is the US military alliance, that NATO endorse eventual membership of Ukraine and Georgia. And as usual, the Europeans didn't continue to object. They just went along with the United States. And this was an incredibly provocative action. Provocative for so many reasons, most notably the fact that Ukraine should be neutral between the two big powers, just for safety of the whole world. Second, that Ukraine had come into its sovereignty with the declaration of neutrality, and the US was directly challenging that. Third, Ukraine at the time was deeply divided internally over the NATO enlargement question. The government in power, the one that came in after the so-called Orange Revolution, wanted it, but public opinion did not run along with that government. And that government, in fact, would lose the election the following year. Provocative because Russia had warned specifically the United States, NATO enlargement to Ukraine is a red line. Do not cross it. That was Putin's message in 2007. And provocative, of course, perhaps most of all from a historic point of view. If one just looks at the map, it's quite plain what the US tactic is. Expansion of NATO would be that all of Russia's Black Sea neighbors would be NATO countries: Ukraine, Romania, Bulgaria, Turkey, and Georgia. And Russia would be surrounded. And Russia's naval base in Sevastopol would basically be neutered by this. It would be made ineffectual because the Black Sea would become a NATO sea. So that was the idea. And Russia said that this is absolutely disastrous.
In August 2008, the US announces that it will deploy ballistic missiles defense systems in Poland, be followed by later Romania.
This comes back to the fundamental position of Russia regarding national security, which is that we need space to keep away the United States from our territory and our borders. And missiles don't take long to fly from Eastern Europe to Russia. And the US started unilaterally deploying Aegis missile systems, first in Poland, then later Romania, as part of the post-anti-ballistic missile reality. And this is what Russia objected to. Now we have missiles of the United States surrounding us close to our borders. Our national security, again, is being deeply threatened. The United States response was, this is none of your business. We do what we want.
In 2014, we have this coup in Ukraine. You mentioned the role of Victoria Nuland in the whole situation.
Well, in the fall of 2013, tensions were very high in Ukraine because the economic situation was not good. The financial situation was very difficult. The IMF was pushing harsh measures on Ukraine, and the European Union was pushing Ukraine to sign a pathway to EU membership. And at the same time, the president of Ukraine was being told by Putin, you can't do that. We're your main trade partner. We have a free trade arrangement. Any arrangement you make with the European Union should include us as a party also, so that we are not adversely affected by your treaty. And we will provide you with financing on much better terms than the IMF, because you're just falling into the Western orbit that way and the Western demands that way. And so there was a tug of war between Europe and Russia over Ukraine. It was a very tense situation. Protests broke out in the Maidan, the big plaza in Kiev, in late 2013. It's known and clear the United States stoked those protests. In fact, American politicians came and told them, we're with you. Just suppose the Chinese and Russian political leaders had come to the US Capitol on June 6th, 2021, January 6th, in that demonstration. How would we feel about it? Well, this is what the United States did. We're with you. But then things got violent in January and especially February 2014. And it's pretty clear the United States had a very active hand in the escalation of tensions and eventually the violent storming of government buildings that led to the regime change, with Yanukovych fleeing for his life from Kiev and the United States immediately endorsing a post-Yanukovych government. So the United States did not say when Yanukovych fled, we can't let violence overthrow the constitutional order. The United States said, we endorse the next government immediately. And many of us suspect that basically the US orchestrated a great deal of that. And one of the pieces of evidence is a remarkable phone call between the then Assistant Secretary of State, now the acting Deputy Secretary of State, Victoria Nuland, perhaps our hardest line neocon in the US government, caught on a phone call with the US ambassador to Ukraine, Jeffrey Piat, saying who should be the next government in Ukraine, who should be in, who should be out. And this is a call that is made about 4 weeks before the actual violent overthrow. And it describes exactly who's going to become the next prime minister. So many of us listen to that and add in the other pieces that we know and believe that this was a typical US regime change operation. Others say, no, this was just two people having a chat about what could come next, which seems very naive to me. But the Russians view it absolutely as a case of the US conspiring on replacing the Yanukovych regime with a Russophobic government that actually came after Yanukovych.
In March 2014, President Putin characterizes the regime change as a coup, stating that those who stood behind the latest events in Ukraine had a different agenda.
Well, it's interesting. George Friedman, who is the CEO of Stratfor, a U.S. security consultancy company, called the February coup, and I'm paraphrasing, one of the most obvious coups in history. And I think that that's right. The U.S. says, no, it's not a coup. It's a popular rebellion against the government. We had nothing to do with it. Victoria Nuland just passed out cookies, and Senator McCain just gave a supporting speech, and American NGOs gave money to the demonstrators. But really, this has nothing to do with us. That's one view. The other view is the United States played a deep role in orchestrating I would say, a typical U.S.-led regime change operation. I think that's more likely. As always, the relevant documents are hidden. The CIA is completely unaccountable. No one asks any questions in our media. So if it is a regime change operation, the United States government doesn't have to talk, never does talk, hides what it's doing, it just smiles and goes on. And we know that happens repeatedly. And my guess is that it happened here.
In March 2014, President Obama marks Russia as a regional power.
Look, the whole U.S. approach is one of arrogance, which is we don't have to talk to anybody. We don't have to negotiate with anybody. We do what we want, and the rest better get in line. That's the attitude. And frankly, if I were a U.S. president facing a country with 6,000 nuclear warheads, I wouldn't mock them. I would try to negotiate and deal constructively with a counterpart, not through mockery.
What's so amazing, because in Wolfowitz doctrine, it mentions that Russia is a superpower, that we should take care of it, but Obama marks them as a regional power. It's so amazing to how.
Well, Russia was called, I think, by John McCain, although I may be misattributing the famous quote, a gas station with nuclear weapons, to paraphrase. In other words, lots of mockery, rather than a major country, a major society, a country with enormous scientific and technological capacity and skills. But the U.S. attitude all along, at least since what I've been seeing close up, is one of disdain and American arrogance. We do what we want. That is the overriding common factor of all this history, which is the United States feels it doesn't have to listen. And when I say U.S., I mean these security establishment. It doesn't have to listen to any other country.
And we have 2014 and 2015 agreements, these Minsk I and Minsk II. Why they were after these agreements? What was the problem? What forced them to go after these agreements?
After the Yanukovych government fell, the new government that came in was a very Russophobic and very nationalistic government. One of the first laws voted by the Rada, by the parliament, was to ban Russian as an official language. And though it wasn't implemented, it sent an immediate signal. We are Ukrainian nationalists, and Russian culture and Russian language and Russian people are not going to have a say here. And this led to big anti-Kyiv reactions in the ethnically Russian parts of Ukraine, including in Crimea with the referendum for joining Russia, and in eastern Ukraine, the Donbass, Donetsk and Lugansk, where parts of the Ukrainian military, the Russian-speaking, Russian-led parts, broke away in the east and declared new autonomous republics. And this led to the risk of a full-scale civil war. And to try to prevent such a civil war, these Minsk agreements were negotiated between these breakaway regions and the Ukrainian central government. And the Minsk II agreement in particular called for autonomy of the Russian ethnic regions of the Donbass. And the UN Security Council backed the Minsk II agreement, and France and Germany declared themselves as guarantors of the Minsk II agreement. There was only one problem, and that is the Ukrainian government had no intention of honoring the Minsk II agreement, that is to grant autonomy to these ethnically Russian regions. And so the Ukrainian government just ignored the Minsk agreements and failed to implement it. The United States, as backer of Kyiv, just said that's fine. And so too did Germany and France. They ignored the failure of Ukraine to honor what it had signed, and it offered not only no pressure, but basically tacit support to Ukraine to ignore the diplomacy.
In 2019, the US unilaterally withdraws from the Intermediate Nuclear Force Treaty. Russia harshly criticizes this event.
These are nuclear weapons for use in the intermediate range, not intercontinental ballistic missiles, but nuclear weapons that would be used in a European war. And the INF Treaty, the Intermediate Nuclear Force Treaty, had limited the deployment of these weapons. The U.S. claimed Russia was violating the treaty. Russia claimed the U.S. was violating the treaty. Rather than negotiating, as should be done, typical of the Trump administration, Trump walked out of the treaty unilaterally, recalling what had happened 17 years earlier when the United States unilaterally withdrew from the anti-ballistic missile treaty. So this was just another step of destabilization. And recall that one of Russia's greatest points of opposition to Ukrainian membership in NATO was the prospect of missiles being placed in Ukraine, just as they were being placed in Poland and Romania. And Russia wanted to negotiate that would not happen. And again, the United States refused such negotiations.
In September 2021, the US reiterates support for Ukraine's NATO aspiration.
When Biden came into office on January 20th, 2021, tensions were very high. And I had hoped at the time that Biden would cool things down by negotiating with Russia to reduce tensions and to commit NATO isn't going anywhere eastward anytime soon. It turned out that Biden is a neocon through and through, which is not surprising because he always favored the neoconservative message. He always favored NATO enlargement. He played a role in the Yanukovych overthrow, I believe. He always sided with the military-industrial complex. So when he came into office in 2021, the United States repeatedly stated, not only on this September 1, 2021, but at least on two other occasions as well, one at the 2021 NATO summit, and also in another agreement of the State Department and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine, that Ukraine will become part of NATO. And so this reiteration of the intention of NATO enlargement meant that 2021 was a disastrous year in which the diplomacy headed due south to the point of complete rupture. And of course, at the end of 2021 in December, President Putin put on the table a draft agreement, a draft treaty between the United States and Russia regarding security. And the United States, at the core of that was Russia's demand that NATO not enlarge. By the way, the U.S. completely rejected the draft and said it would not negotiate on the question of NATO enlargement. And I tried at the end of 2021 to speak to Biden administration leaders, negotiate. This is your off-ramp. This is the chance to avoid war. But the White House is neocon. They weren't listening. They said NATO enlargement is not Russia's business. Rather extraordinary idea. We're not negotiating, and that was that.
Even after going inside Ukraine, Putin was eager to negotiate in March 2022 in Istanbul, which was left by Ukrainian. Ukrainian, firstly, they wanted to have some agreements. Later, they decided to not go along with those agreements.
I think the best understanding of the special military operation, as Russia calls it, on February 24th, 2022, is that it was a gambit to force negotiations of Ukraine's neutrality. That's how I would interpret it, because the initial military force was certainly not enough to conquer Ukraine. It was a illustration of von Clausewitz's famous dictum that war is a continuation of politics with other means. And this was a continuation of the politics of NATO enlargement, now with other means, with military means. And Zelensky, almost immediately, within a few days of the February 24th launch of the special military operation, said, okay, we can negotiate. Ukraine can be neutral. And that initiated actually a very promising process of exchanges of documents between Russia and Ukraine that could have ended the war in 2022, at least in the interpretation of many people, including myself. And after a few weeks of this, when it looked like matters were moving to a negotiated outcome, the interpretation that I believe to be the case is that the United States came in and told Ukraine, stop, do not negotiate away your right to join NATO. We have your back. We're going to defeat Russia with HIMARS weapon systems, with extraordinarily powerful economic sanctions. Hang in there. We've got your back. I think that's what the United States told Ukraine.
In September 2022, we had the sabotage of Nord Stream pipeline. Everybody was surprised by that event. That was hitting Russian and Germans because these pipeline goes from Russia to Germany.
When it happened, the Western press in London and New York immediately said, well, Russia did it, on theories that were even hard to fathom what they were talking about, because this was Russia's own pipeline. It was the source of Russian income and influence in Europe. That's what the US always objected to, that Russia was the provider of a considerable amount of primary energy resources to Europe. And then the claim is that Russia blew it up on its own, whereas Russia only had to stop any supply of gas to accomplish the same thing without blowing it up and without losing the option to turn it back on. Well, as soon as I saw the explosion, I figured the United States did it, because it's just the kind of harebrained thing that the United States does regularly, so nothing would surprise me. And for a while, the US pointed its finger at Russia. I pointed the finger at the US government with all the preceding evidence of how much Biden and his team hated the pipeline, wanted it to end, and so forth, and much other circumstantial evidence. Then the investigative reporter Seymour Hersh came out with a full account describing how the United States actually did it, which I think holds up till today. Then, crazily enough, the US officials, unnamed, speaking to the New York Times, said, no, it was really the Ukrainians. And we knew about it beforehand. But as typical in the propaganda shell that we live in the United States, even when the US government said it was the Ukrainians, the newspaper shrugged and said, well, that's interesting, and never reported on it again, basically. So this is one of those events that you'd think should be quite important, that we should get to the bottom of it. But we never do because officialdom has its narrative. That's their story. They're sticking with it. Boom. And that's where we are right now. But I think Seymour Hersh probably got this one right.
When this war started, we didn't know anything about the Ukrainian army. But during this war, we learned that this army, 400,000 soldiers were trained during 8 years, 2014 to 2021, trained and equipped by NATO. And on the other hand, there was tremendous sanctions against Russia. Two front of this war, economically and this war in Ukraine. Do you think what was the greatest miscalculation of the Biden administration to go along with war instead of negotiating with Putin?
Clearly, the Biden administration and Obama administration before it, in fact, all of the administrations play a game of chicken. They think that they're going to get along with something by making a threat or making a fait accompli. So first, the U.S. thought, okay, after 2004, we have a pro-NATO government in Ukraine. We'll just push that through. That didn't work, also because Ukrainian public opinion wasn't on side. Yanukovych came in and said, no, I want neutrality. And the people supported that. Well, then I think the next step, the United States said, okay, regime change. We throw the guy out. And now we'll get what we want. And I think that was the next bet that the U.S. made. I don't think they counted on Putin following through immediately by retaking Crimea. And they didn't count on the breakaway republics in the Donbass. Then the U.S. said, okay, we'll just flood Ukraine with weapons and we'll double down on NATO enlargement. What's Russia going to do? And I think Putin said, look, we'll negotiate. And if you don't negotiate, we're going to act. We're not just going to sit there as you pump up the army and the armaments and repeat the call for NATO enlargement. We're not going to sit there when it's so vital for our national security. So Russia tried to negotiate Minsk, and then end of 91, the U.S. repudiated negotiations each time. So Russia acted. Then I think the West thought, okay, now we got him. All we have to do is crushing economic sanctions, and that'll do it. Of course, that didn't do it because they didn't understand that most of the world wasn't going to abide by these sanctions and Russia would have enough trading partners. Then the next escalation or bluff is we'll put in HIMARS and we'll put in other advanced missile systems, and Putin doesn't have the political backing at home to mobilize, and so we'll force him to back off. And the military escalation will do it. Then Putin mobilized in the summer of 2022, said, we're calling up reservists, we're going to expand the army, we're doing the things we need to do. This was another bluff that the United States believed would be decisive. So I think this has been a game of chicken all along, a game. Well, that's how game theorists describe strategic interactions. But it's also, to my mind, the kind of mindset that people in the White House have. They think they're playing a game, not causing hundreds of thousands of deaths, which is what's actually happening. They think this is a strategic game. Can we hold on till after the U.S. election? What should we do? What about putting in F-16s? It's all, game of strategy, rather than realizing that this war is a disaster for everybody and needs to stop. And so I think that this series of miscalculations is just that. It's one after another, believing all we have to do is this next step and we will get past our adversaries.
If Russia gets Odessa and Nikolaev, Ukraine going to be a landlocked. How do you see the future of Ukraine?
Look, I think Ukraine is being destroyed in this process, and that we should sit down on any moment at any day and say it's time to negotiate. We need to protect Ukraine. We need to stop the NATO enlargement. We need the war to end. But it's getting harder and harder to see how this is going to happen, because in 2014, Russia was just asking for neutrality and a long-term lease of Crimea. In 2021, Russia was asking for neutrality and Crimea would remain with Russia, but the Donbass would gain autonomy. That was rejected too. Then Russia annexed 4 territories, Donetsk and Lugansk, Kherson and Zaporizhia. So the demands keep rising. It's getting harder and harder. And negotiations should have happened in 2014. They should have happened in 2021. They should have happened in 2022. I'm no seer or fortune teller. I don't know, but I know this war needs to stop. NATO enlargement never should have taken place. And we need to find a political solution to the contested regions. And I don't think, personally, I doubt that there's any solution in which Crimea goes back to Ukraine, given all this history and given the fact that the Russian naval base has been at Sevastopol since 1783, and given the fact that the Western strategy is to surround Russia in the Black Sea and all of that, I don't think is going to happen. On other fronts, there are different possibilities of negotiation. Will the West lift sanctions? Will Nord Stream get started? Who knows? Many things to discuss. What would the new security arrangements in Europe be? What about the missile placements? So I don't think we can prejudge exactly what a political settlement would be, but I can tell you the current US approach